Welcome to Basic Black. Some of you are joining us on our broadcast, and others of you are joining us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. Tonight, Roots, Rhythm, and Culture, examining ethnic heritage and representation. We, like you, are dealing with the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and are taking precautions. We are working with limited staff, and our guests are joining us remotely. African-American actress Amandla Stenberg once asked, "What would America be like if it loved Black people as much as it loves Black culture?" Amandla was talking about the phenomenon of using certain cultural aspects from communities of color detached from their cultural roots. Experts call it cultural appropriation and point to examples like singer Katy Perry performing while wearing geishas, white rappers adopting the stylistic phrasing of African-American rap artists, and supermodel Karlie Kloss walking designer runways with Native American headdresses. But is the cherry-picking of cultural aspects necessarily harmful, or is it respectful appreciation? And why does it matter? Joining us remotely, Julio Ricardo Varela, founder and publisher of Latino Rebels. He's also the editorial director of Futuro Media and the co-host of the In the Thick Political podcast. Edward Shea, editor of Sampan newspaper in Boston. He's also the chief operating officer at the Asian American Civic Association. And Juan Fernando Lopera, vice president and corporate business diversity officer at Tufts Health Plan and Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Susan X. Jane, principal of Navigators Consulting. She has over 25 years of experience working in the field of culture, diversity, and inclusion. Welcome to all of you. So let me start this way, Julio. What's the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation?
That's a great question. I think cultural appropriation, and we're just coming off Cinco de Mayo this week, which was a weird celebration in the middle of a pandemic. And I think examples of cultural appropriation is when the right intent is not being used. So I think you take something like Cinco de Mayo, which has become this, even though it's a, it's not even celebrated in Mexico. It's become sort of a holiday in the United States that has been primarily from the Mexican American community, but it has become something else. And it has become, I think, on par with St. Patrick's Day. And there's good things and bad things. And there's a lot of bad things that have happened where it becomes sort of like marketing, and it becomes a place that I don't know if you appreciate the culture or even the history of what Cinco de Mayo is all about. And the fact that it's not even fully celebrated in Mexico, it's not Mexico's Independence Day. I think that's the perfect example of it's become part of the American fabric. I don't think for the right reasons. But the battle's already been lost to not to put a pun on why Cinco de Mayo. That was actually based on a battle when the Mexicans beat the French. But I think like that's the perfect example. And you've seen a lot of in the past examples of people calling it like Cinco de Drinko or wearing like big sombreros and doing all this other things. And there've actually been cases in the media where people have had to apologize for kind of taking it a little bit too far, because it does perpetuate stereotypes of sort of like the drunk Mexican or Latino people. So that to me is cultural appropriation at its worst. I think cultural appreciation is when you do have the right intent and you do actually engage the community and actually understand that we need to be partners in whatever is being presented or displayed, or or we need to be at the table. And it's a question of representation. And those companies and those organizations that understand that are, I think, the companies of the future and are the companies that are leading the way.
Okay, same question to you, Juan. You want to pick up on the Cinco de Mayo? Because I know that's something that's very irritating to you.
Oh, goodness. Indeed. So I'm originally from Colombia. In fact, greetings from Colombia. I'm currently calling in from my native country. And no one in Colombia knows what Cinco de Mayo is. As Julio mentioned, actually to support what he stated, only 10% of Americans even know the reason behind Cinco de Mayo. A lot of people think is Mexican Independence Day. That's actually on September 16th. As Julio mentioned, it celebrates the Battle of Puebla during the Franco-Mexican War of 1862. No one knows that. And to his point, if you really want to appreciate the culture at a minimum, you should know what is being celebrated, as opposed to just simply be an excuse to party and get drunk, which is often the case. That day in Mexico, for the few Mexicans who do celebrate it, is a day when families come together, cook, dance, and pray for their ancestors, and no one really knows that. And in my area in Boston, we have a large, fast-growing Latino community, 130,000 strong in the greater Boston area. 28% are Puerto Rican, another 24% are from the Dominican Republic, and then there's a good amount of Salvadorians, Colombians. Very small minority of the Latinos in Boston are from Mexico. So when you mention Cinco de Mayo, no one knows what you're talking about. And I like that thought of cultural appreciation. I actually also like the term cultural adaptation. If an organization really wants to do this right, you take the time to celebrate culture, not simply by translating an American slogan. You take the time to culturally adapt to make sure that it resonates with the communities that you're trying to serve. So I use the term cultural adaptation quite often.
Edward, same question to you. What's the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation?
Sure. I would agree with Juan and Julio in terms of intent, but I would also like to make the point that sometimes someone may not have a negative intent and still be culturally appropriating, things that are important to the culture they're taking from. I mean, you mentioned the geisha dress earlier, which in Chinese culture we call it a qipao. And there was a case not too long ago that became pretty infamous of a high school girl wearing a qipao to her prom, and then basically it became polarizing where some people were saying, don't steal from my culture to make yourself look beautiful, not understanding what it really means. But I don't think that high school student actually had a negative intent when she decided to wear that dress. That doesn't necessarily excuse the act of wearing the dress without understanding and recognizing that, the qipao in many ways, because of like Hollywood's perpetual portrayal of Asian women as, items to fetishize, that's perpetuating that myth of the fetishistic sexual item from, Asian culture. So that's a case of cultural appropriation without a clear intent. So I think it's important to understand that really, I think the thread there that both Julio and Juan picked up on is the idea that there has to be an understanding of the culture you're taking from, and stop and think about what you're doing before you actually do it.
So Susan, same question.
I think of cultural appropriation as taking just the surface aspects of culture and disposing of the rest of that culture. I think when people engage in cultural appropriation, oftentimes it's the expression of culture, the beauty, the art, the music, the dance, without really taking on board the issues, the ideas, the beliefs and values of that culture, really leaving that on the side. And I think, especially in our own culture, we kind of shop around for identities, but when those communities really need people to show up, people are not around, And I think there's also this idea of appropriation, this idea of people getting funds or receiving money or earning money off the backs of other people's cultural capital. So I think adding that idea of culture as capital, as something that's valuable and something that's commodified is important too. Especially when we're talking about the worlds of fashion and entertainment, we should understand that artists are commodifying culture, particularly Black culture, in my concern, and really trading in on that. And they're earning a lot of money while not really contributing to communities that they are taking those ideas from. So I think you can appreciate culture. You can take in the whole culture and really engage deeply with it, but you really want to make sure you're not just skinning a culture and wearing it around like a costume.
So, Susan, I want to get your response to Justin Bieber, who has said, "I appreciate Black culture. You know, look, I'm using it in my songs, but I don't see black and white. It seems the same to me."
Ah,
That's a
no,
quote, by the way.
that is definitely cultural appropriation. He commodifies Black culture and has commodified it throughout his whole career. I think that he was discovered by Usher. So a big part of what made him who he was his use of Black culture, use of Black vernacular, Black music styles. And so to say he doesn't see black and white when we are living through a time when there is so much division and Black people are struggling with violence, police brutality, political marginalization, to sing and dance like us, but then to not care about us, I think is the worst kind of commodification. And to take on locks, which have a spiritual and a symbolic significance to the culture that is about the Black experience and not just merely about the expression of it, really is an indicator of, like I said, the worst kind of cultural appropriation, because we need people to show up for us, not just when they think it's cute.
So, you all have given great examples and responded to them, and I can imagine some people listening to this saying, "Well, it's not nice," but you know, what does it harm in the end? I mean, who's harmed? Susan, you raised that there are people making money, so you've articulated one harm, because the people for whom the culture was derived are not partaking in the money that a Justin Bieber was able to derive. But Julio, I was interested in the case of the woman who had, I guess the only word to use is pretended to be Latino, and was in very high circles in the legal departments and lawyering in New York, and then was discovered not to be so. Is that an example of harm that you can point to?
Yeah, that's a clear example of harm, and her name is Natasha Bannon, and she was actually a contributor to Latino Rebels, and we had to kind of deplatform her because our community saw right through that. And again, I'm with Edward. I don't think it's about bad intent. I don't think people come in to be like, I'm going to steal culture. But I do think there is something to be said about how appropriation is used as a weapon to get access to, more access to power and representation. And who are the communities that suffer? Where's the harm? The harm is in communities of color who don't have the access, because obviously here was a clear example of someone who also, in fairness, had a Latino stepdad, grew up in a cultural place where she might have grown up culturally in that world, but was given opportunities because she claimed to be Latina. And so when you start taking away opportunities for Latina lawyers who already have problems getting into, places of power, then there is harm. And I think the bigger question about, well, this doesn't harm the community, I'm like, it does, because not only does it create this false perception about how Latinos are viewed, it also gives sort of, I think, the white power structure an out to be like, you know what, we don't have to worry about you. So then we're continuing to fight for representation, fight for the crumbs, fight for the seat at the table. And so the examples where we can have that access to power, when other people who are not Latino or are not of color come in and take it away from us, then it's just a lost opportunity. Mm-hmm. I know so many Latina lawyers who told me that they just felt hurt and ignored with this. And I think it's more serious, and I do think it's something that I'm glad we're talking more about it. So, but that's a clear example of harm, because it happened. It impacted Latino lawyers, and I know that for a fact.
Mm-hmm. Juan, in your arena, in the corporate spaces, you've seen it be harmful.
Yeah, actually what comes to mind is in the so-called supplier diversity space. So opportunities for minority business enterprises. There's a reason why there's a certification process for women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, LGBT-owned, and others to be certified, because prior to that, there were companies that were taking advantage and taking up that opportunity from a diverse supplier by claiming to be so. And maybe they would have one or two individuals who were diverse and then just there to get access to that contract. So there was a reason why many organizations stood up a certification process so that there could be more opportunity for minority business enterprises to bid on contracts, and is a painful exercise for many MBEs to go through to be certified, but it was necessary because there were instances of companies that were not minority owned that were taking advantage and taking that opportunity, and we already know that there's limited opportunity to begin with, so that's what comes to mind in the corporate setting as to why we need to be very intentional about how we go about this. And that's a perfect example of cultural appropriation, taking away revenue from someone else.
Edward, same question to you. How is it harmful?
Well, I think in general, cultural appropriation puts someone into a place where they look like they're speaking from a place of authority, because it looks like they have, come from that culture in some way, shape, or form. I have a personal story in particular, because in addition to what I was introduced as, I actually teach as a master at Harvard University for martial arts. And so martial arts is one of the arenas that a lot of cultural appropriation has occurred, both in Hollywood and locally. But in terms of the personal story, there's a gentleman who actually studied out of my school, and he's now teaching in another state, a Caucasian gentleman, and he earns his living doing Chinese wellness healing. So most people see him as a Chinese healer, a martial artist, but recently we found him online spouting off hate speech about, Kung Flu, Wuhan virus, stuff like that. And so then someone who's in a position of power, looking like he's speaking for the culture, is then turning around and spreading, bad rumors about the culture. So that's where cultural appropriation gets clearly harmful.
Now, here's a question that all of you can appreciate, and it always feels a little dicey to some. Is it okay, Edward, and I want you to start off, for some in one ethnic group to culturally appropriate somebody else in another ethnic group?
I think that is still problematic, and it comes back to the discussion of intent and whether they're understanding when they do something like that, whether it's appreciation or appropriation. I know, for example, in Japan, there was a time period where there's a lot of adoption of African-American culture. They were obsessed with rappers. They were obsessed with dressing like the rappers were dressing. And, it comes down to whether they're using that to take away from, the music scene, or if they're using that because they really love, rappers. And I don't particularly have a personal opinion about that because I only know so much about, culture in Japan. But that was just an example of where I saw that happen. But then on top of that, there's, also a lot of, even within Asian, cultures, there's a lot of, divisions among ethnicities. So if you go, to Chinatown, you'll find a lot of Japanese restaurants opened by Chinese owners or, Korean owners. So then the question is whether they're selling their food off as authentic Japanese food. And then if they're doing that, are they, casting the wrong idea of what Japanese culture puts out there in terms of their food and art? Another prime example, which unfortunately was, again, Caucasian taking Asian culture. In New York, there were a string of restaurants opened, and each was called Lucky, and then they had a different name. And one of them was actually opened by Gordon Ramsay, Lucky Cat, I believe. And so there was an outcry about that because they were all basically saying that Asian Chinese food in particular, was unhealthy, was dirty, and that was sort of their selling point. And so it was a big outcry.
Susan.
I think that one of the things that Edward pointed out that's really important to think about is power and voice. Mm-hmm. And I think when people think about why is it harmful, it's that we have a lot of conversation around culture in our dialogue right now, and whose voice gets to really speak for a community, who gets to take up that space. And so as we think about, for instance, the Black community, hip hop culture, it is all around the world. And we see many ways that cultures take that on board and make it their own. And we see the ways that people deeply appreciate the struggle and the history of cultures cross-culturally. And I think that's always really important to do, because that's one of the things that makes it really rich and engaging to engage with other people, is to learn more about them and to learn more about how they experience the world. I think the line is, are you trading in on stereotypes of that culture? Are you trading in and looking at them through a white gaze? Or are you really appreciating that culture? We can think about hip hop, groups like the Wu-Tang Clan. Is that appropriation or appreciation? And how do we begin to kind of parse that out? I think it changes over time. There's a lot of crossover, like I said, particularly in hip hop. Hip hop samples culture from all around the world, and there are lots of examples about that. But as people are really wanting to have more authentic voice, we want to make sure that we make some space for those authentic voices, and that we're not taking up airtime from other cultures, even if they are other marginalized cultures.
So, Susan, here's the deal. So many people know what they know about a culture only through the stereotypes. So they think they are being appreciative of or recognizing the culture because they only know the stereotypes. So what do you do with that? How do you untangle that so that there is the appreciation piece comes with an intent and an understanding that there actually is a culture attached to it, and what you have thought to be culture is actually stereotype?
I mean, we all have information at our fingertips right now. So the first thing is to kind of go down the rabbit hole. As you said, it was Cinco de Mayo this week. And so, I saw lots of people posting information about why you should think about it a little differently than you have. So if people want to appreciate culture, that information is out there and available. There are lots of people that are online or in the real world hosting events and opportunities for people to connect to a culture. So if you want to know more about a culture, go and visit it, whether it's digitally or in person, and learn. Go as somebody that is culturally humble and open to hearing and listening before you just trade in on those stereotypes. And if you don't have any engagement with people of a different background, it might be a really good opportunity to educate yourself. The information is out there, but as everyone said, it's about intent. Do you really intend to be respectful? If so, then do your work.
Juan, I have a favorite statement, which is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So I'm just going to put that out there and ask, how do you get past, what do you do with people who have accepted the stereotypes as the culture?
Yeah. So whenever people ask me where I'm from and I say I'm from Colombia, often what I get is, oh, have you seen Narcos on Netflix?
Oh, wow.
And it is just playing to the stereotype of a country that has had a struggle years ago with Narcos and all of that, but the country has so much more to offer. So, and as a way for people to, I guess, make a connection in an odd way. So I politely educate them on other aspects of the country, the people, the culture, the music, the coffee, the emeralds, the many great things about Colombia that most people just don't know about. So that's a very clear sort of interaction that I get from people who I guess are well-intended and want to make that connection because they've seen something about Colombia on Netflix, a show that is actually the main actor is not even from Colombia. He has a terrible Colombian accent.
I didn't know that.
To portray.
Wow.
So I couldn't even watch it because it was so bad. It's like watching someone trying to do a really bad Boston accent. That's how bad it was. So I take the opportunity. I used to get upset, and now I see that as a invitation to share more about the country. And actually, one of those interactions from a few years ago turned into someone wanting to come visit and fell in love with the country, the people, the music, the food. So, I think there's a fine line there where some people are just ignorant and you can ignore them. But others are, they want to have a window into learning more. They just approach it in the wrong way.
Edward, would you add to that?
Yeah, I think in addition to urging people to go educate themselves, I think we need to take to task the institutions that perpetuate the stereotypes so that people have more opportunities and ways of learning about other cultures. And the two in particular I have in mind are Hollywood. There's a lot of cultural appropriation going on in movies where they cast roles from other cultures, not with actors from those scenes. Like, for example, Crazy Rich Asians is one example where they had an all Asian cast, but then they very much looked at a very narrow lens of Asian culture. And then you have, for example, some of the Marvel movies like Doctor Strange, where they cast what could have been an Asian role as a Irish person. And then they used that Irish person to basically, tell stories about Nepalese culture and mysticism and martial arts. Wow. So it was not the greatest way of, telling the story about the culture. And then also, I just recall growing up, in world history, what we learned about Asia was Opium War, the communists, Vietnam War. There was very little talk about the benefits that came from other cultures. It was mostly, the negative interactions between America and those cultures.
Well, that's a good place to end our discussion right now. And I thank you for that illumination, for all of you to illustrate very clearly what cultural appropriation is and what cultural appreciation is. But that's the end of our broadcast and the end of our show. Thanks to all of our guests, and thank you for joining us. Stay with us as we continue our conversation on Facebook and Twitter. We are on Facebook and Twitter with our post show, continuing our discussion on roots, rhythm, and culture, examining ethnic heritage and representation. Julio, I wanted to get your voice in on getting past the stereotypes that some people believe are culture. That they believe the stereotypical images are what they know as the culture of, let's say, Latinos. So how do you work with that?
I also think, your previous question about communities sort of appropriating other communities. I do think the Latino community has a lot of work to do in itself to stop the stereotypes. I mean, Juan was talking about Narcos, which is a very Latin American film series, and you had Latin Americans perpetuating stereotypes about Colombians, right? So, that's one example. Another example has to do with race. Recently, I think last year, J-Lo called herself La Negrita, right? In a song, the black woman. It's a term of endearment. It's rooted in anti-blackness. J-Lo's not black. And it speaks to someone like J-Lo, who is a lighter, more white passing Latina, who is appropriating black culture and actually invisibilizing Afro-Latinos and Afro-Latinas in our community who have, who are essential to our fabric. The same thing with reggaeton, right? Reggaeton started as, music from Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean communities, and who are the top singers now. Bad Bunny is a white Puerto Rican man. So it's easy to just point to outside organizations when we, as a community ourselves, have to do a lot of the work. That to me it's easy to say, Hollywood, obviously, corporate worlds, obviously, but also in ourselves, we still have a long way to go as Latinos. And, those examples are just one of many. And even to the point of even as a journalist myself, when we really try to challenge those stereotypes, it's all about, the situation that's happening in Colombia now. in Juan's home country with protests. I don't assign it to a non-Colombian journalist. I assign it to a Colombian journalist. Or when things are happening in Puerto Rico, it's a Puerto Rican journalist, or in Mexico. So we have to kind of do more of that ourselves. I think sometimes we wait for external forces to change the stereotypes, when in fact we have to do a lot ourselves in sort of mass entertainment when it comes to Spanish language television and the whiteness of that. And so it's kind of a two-pronged battle for me and mission.
So Julio, is at a time when we are having a lot of discussions about race and racism, we are still in a moment where we are calling a racial reckoning. Is the discussion within the Latino community about the Afro-Latino segment of the population versus not amplified now, being taken more public, more in-depth than it has been in the past? And what's your sense?
Yes and no. I think, we did an analysis last year during the Black Lives Matter protests and looked at news coverage and Univision and Telemundo, and they were just as bad as watching Fox News. They're, the angry protesters and the violence against police. And I think that's a problem because you're literally using anti-Blackness as a news item. So, we have to be real about Afro-Latinidad in our community. It has been invisibilized. I do think you start seeing independent media being much more intentional. So us, at Futuro Media, where I work, we're very intentional about that and kind of are questioning it each and every day. I don't think media organizations in the Latino mediascape are doing the same thing. I think we're seeing sort of like, the racial reckoning happened, for 2 months, Callie, last year?
Yeah.
And, and now it's kind of like the pendulum swinging and we're seeing backlash and we're seeing, conservative media or other voices, or even just white liberal media kind of saying like, well, we've kind of patted ourselves on the back. So this is a journey. It's a long step-by-step process. It's not going to be solved overnight. But I do think the biggest takeaway for our community is that we aren't, I say it, we aren't a monolith. There's still a lot of white supremacy in our community when it comes to representation and when it comes to appropriation. Go to Mexico or go to other places where we see appropriation of indigenous cultures, where they've become commodified, where, Juan talking about in Colombia, the proud Indio, the indigenous, this representation of Latin America it's just not grounded in reality or in a historical fact. So I think we kind of have to sort of, as Latin Americans, look at our own past, just as the 1619. I wish there was a 1619 project for Latin America. Maybe that's something we should be doing at Futuro, but I think that's something that's really important.
Okay. Susan, Juan earlier mentioned some of the harmful aspects of cultural appropriation in the business space, in the corporate space. I wonder if you would amplify that.
Yeah, I think that we're in a moment where people are really wanting to bring their whole selves to work in ways that maybe they haven't been able to before. And that means that cultures need to be open to those different points of view and to being able to see people as whole people and not think of them as stereotypes. I mean, on the cultural level, we have all of these changes in the way that culture is expressed, and that trickles down into ways that we engage with each other interpersonally. So doing away with some of those harmful cultural practices like the Cinco de Mayo party in the office are really important, but also is important to make sure that people aren't buying into stereotypes as they're thinking about and engaging with coworkers cross-culturally. Like I'm thinking about how we've had to have legislation so that Black people can wear their natural hair to the workplace. Those stereotypes that we see in terms of the culture at large trickle down into the way that people have access and opportunity in the workplace. And so as so many organizations are really wanting to increase diversity, they've got to open up their culture and making sure that they're making space in white dominant cultures to be more open. And people of color and Black people who want to wear their natural hair in the workplace shouldn't be be penalized for it anymore. And we still have a long way to go for people to begin to open up to that. And I think especially as we're coming out of COVID and returning to the workplace, we've had this racial reckoning while we're all in our homes. We haven't been in spaces with each other. And so I was thinking about, as we go back to the workplace, don't touch people's hair. Things have changed since last year. So some of those harmful practices, I think people are going to have to get used to, that there are new rules in place, and that reckoning that, you know, as you said, Julio, kind of came and went. It didn't go for Black people. We are no longer going to be accepting the same limitations, and we won't be stereotyped in the workplace. So I think organizations that have been working really hard at that throughout this whole year will do well. For organizations that threw up that black box and kept it moving, you really are going to need to take a look at your culture to make sure that you're creating a place where people can be treated equally.
And Edward, the same could be said for the AAPI hate campaign or anti-hate campaign and what has been revealed since people were back in the office. So how do you see this playing out in the office? What are some of the concerns that you may have, and in the way that Susan has expressed that we've been at home and nobody's interacted, but it's a new day for folks who respect their culture?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been interesting because even beyond just the cultural discussions, obviously there's the discussions about safety and hate right now. So, I mean, it was just yesterday that the two elderly ladies got stabbed, and I believe it was California. So, I mean, there's a lot of discussions about what do we do as a business to allow our staff, which is very diverse, to feel safe and to feel safe in being themselves at work. There's a lot of discussion among the Chinatown community about, you know, can we integrate in self-defense? Can we integrate in, you know, more groups to do patrols or something like that? And so there's a tension there that has to be addressed. That comes from the discussion about the culture and, you know, racism and everything around it. So there's definitely an issue that has to be looked at, that I think everyone in Chinatown is very, very basically on edge about at the moment.
Juan, I'll let you add to this because this is where you live. So when Susan raised the point that we haven't been with each other and now we have these things to think about, it gave me pause, I have to say.
That's right. Yeah. No, I think it's, being back in the workplace is going to be odd for so many reasons, because we have a dual pandemic going on. We have racial injustice pandemic, and we have the COVID pandemic, and I think going in with a mindset of inclusion, a mindset of the experience is not going to be the same if I'm a Latino family member who's been most impacted by COVID, or Black or Brown family who's been most impacted by COVID and has not been able to isolate in a suburban neighborhood. And the lived experience has been so different coming into the workplace. I think appreciation for the trauma that our Black and Brown and communities have gone through will be really important as we make it back in the workplace. And organizations need to think about the culturally adapted, culturally appropriate resources that ought to be provided as we make it back in the workplace. Not to say that the white community has been spared from COVID, plenty of impact across the board for sure, but we've seen the disproportionate impact in Black and Brown communities. So I think we need to take that into account as we make our way back into the workplace, because the impact has gone beyond catching COVID, and now there's economic impact. There's so many other, educational gaps that are now impacting our Black and Brown kids. So all of that needs to be taken into account as we make our way back in the workplace.
All right, I'm going to ask you guys a last question. It's going to sound like, didn't she ask this before? But I'm going to put it a different way because I want to be crystal clear if anybody's watching this conversation about how you define, identify cultural appropriation. So here we all are on a show that celebrates multiculturalism. right? We're all in a multicultural society. That's what we all have been saying for ad infinitum till we're all crazy. All right. So somebody watching this could say, so if I choose to sample some of the pieces of cultures in a multicultural society, why is that not appreciation?
It is, but you got to do it. You got to know where to go. You know, don't go to some bar in South Boston, you know, from Margaret, you know what I mean? So it's like, because it's Cinco de Drinko, you know, and say like, oh, I'm being multicultural. I mean, look, you know, just in Boston alone, do people even know that some of the best like tacos are in East Boston, or like the best like Central American food is, you know, going towards Logan Airport? Have you ever been there? You know, do you go to those immigrant restaurants? Do you go to JP? I mean, do you go to my favorite like Cuban restaurant? I'm not trying to, you know, there's a great place in JP. Do you start going outside of, you know, just to focus this on Boston? You know, there's so many places. It's just like Juan says, you know, Boston has always been a Latino city, and it's been saving it. I think the Latin American community and the Latino community is part of the drivers behind this city. But we don't see those faces, right? Because you don't see those faces. So the cultural approach, you know, perfect example. I was walking down Back Bay like 2 years ago, and there was a Venezuelan pupusas stand, you know, and there was a lunch truck, and I talked to the guy, and he was from Venezuela, and he was making pupusas, and I was like, this is awesome. So there's places, you got to find them the right. That to me is the big question.
Okay. Juan, how would you answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think take the time to learn, and also before labels are placed on people, Latino, Hispanic, Latinx, BIPOC, just get a feel for how people prefer to self-identify. I think the perfect example to me is Latinx, sort of this new term, this new label that's been placed on us, and I understand that there's good reasons for it. And to me, I'm open to all things that unite communities. So I'm not saying that I'm anti sort of some of these new terms like BIPOC, Latinx, but you know, that one specifically, when you realize that only about a quarter of the Latino population surveyed in the U.S., this is based on a Pew Research, even know what Latinx means. That tells you something about, you know, whether you should be using that term to put that label on the community. So I think finding out more about the community, you know, I identify with all these terms, but my preference is I'm Colombian. That's where I was born. That's where my roots are. So I think taking the time to understand and get a feel for what people are comfortable with, I think is important. And that to me is the cultural adaptation piece that is a very positive thing. You know, we don't want people to take away from this that any type of cultural connection is a bad thing. That's not what we're saying here. But take the time to culturally adapt.
I just want to point out that our use of it here came from young Latino people. Okay, that's what they said they wanted to be called. So just to be clear,
that's right.
All right, Susan.
That's right.
I think the difference between appropriation and appreciation is kind of the difference between organic, unprocessed food and processed food. You want to make sure that the culture that you're enjoying and appreciating and consuming comes from a place that is organic, that's from the culture, that is whole and unprocessed by white supremacy. I think that's the easiest way to think about it. So curate your culture like you curate your food. Okay. If it's coming from the culture, you're all good. If it's coming processed through white supremacy, then you might want to think about consuming something different.
That's a great thing. Edward, last word.
Sure. So I would agree with what they all said already. I would take it, in a similar direction in terms of, if I'm a martial artist, I'm a performance artist. I always pick up other, cultural, acts into those performances, but I'm doing it carefully. I'm thinking about what's the message going out? And it shouldn't just be, for just culturally related things, every time you do something in public or do something that could impact people or send a message, you should really think about that message and then do the research behind it and be mindful. So, it's like what Julio said, find the right place, go, if you want Vietnamese food, go down Dorchester Ave, go a little bit further in,
Right.
If you want Chinese food, go to Chinatown. So yeah, just think carefully about what you're doing.
I thank all of you for your insight and wisdom. Thank you so much for joining us.